Welcome to Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is EconTalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is November 21st, 2013, and my guest is Doug Lemov, a managing director of Uncommon Schools, a chain of charter schools in the Northeast. Before that, he founded a charter school in Boston. He's the author of Teach Like a Champion and Practice Perfect. Doug, welcome to Econ Talk.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Now, in a recent talk you gave, you tell the origins of your book, Teach Like a Champion. You were looking at New York State test scores, and there's a negative relationship between school performance and how many of its students come from homes below the poverty level. But you noticed something interesting beyond that negative correlation. Tell us what you noticed and what you decided to do about it.
Sure. Well, like you said, at first, there's a lot of hand-wringing because you can see that the zip code that you're born to often determines the scholastic outcomes, the school that you go to. While we were wringing our hands, someone pointed out, for any level of poverty, even 100% of kids in a school living in poverty, there are always schools that defy expectations. There are always teachers who defy expectations. And despite all the difficulties and challenges and ravages of poverty, there are people who beat the odds. And so what we realized is we can worry about the we can worry about the problem, or we can worry about the solution. And so it struck us that we could be out there looking for those teachers who are in the upper right-hand corner of the graph, people who have 95, 100% of their kids living in poverty, and who still achieve incredible outcomes for their students. And one of the interesting things about it is that if this were any other sector other than education, but we're Silicon Valley, and we had figured out how to put immense amounts of additional memory on a chip for the same amount of size, people would be engaged in industrial espionage, trying to sneak into chip fabrication plants to figure out what it was that made one plant's results so incredible. But in education, that wasn't part of the culture. That wasn't something that we did. And so I just went out and started watching people when I could identify people who were in the upper right-hand corner.
Now, what hat,
outliers.
What hat were you wearing?
Well, at the time I was wearing several hats. I was working as a consultant for a group of schools that were trying to get better, and I was in the planning stages of working for Uncommon Schools, and I just left business school where sort of thinking data-wise like this was common. And so, it was fascinating. I went to some of these classrooms, and as soon as I went to two or three of them, I had my second aha, which is I'm not coming back without my video camera, because what incredible teachers do in their classrooms is so remarkable and breathtaking that I just felt like, no one's going to believe this or really be able to understand what this teacher did unless I show it to them.
And we'll put up some links to some of those videos are online, and if you get the book, it comes with a DVD that has lots of examples of great teachers doing these techniques. But after you gathered these techniques and you held some workshops, you were surprised at, one, how fabulously appreciative the teachers were of the workshops, and how 6 months later, very little happened for them that was different. So talk about why your initial attempt to implement some of these techniques that you observed failed.
Yeah. We talk about this a lot. We have a name for it. We call it the get it, do it gap. And this exists with almost any complex endeavor, but I think we often fail to recognize that teaching is a performance profession, and that you do it live in front of an audience of 30 or so 4 times a day, and sometimes it's a very skeptical audience of 30. And so having a great lesson on Tuesday guarantees you nothing about Wednesday's lesson. You have to teach it all over again. And if you're crashing on Wednesday and you ask a question and all the kids look at you funny, or if they won't sit down when you ask them to, you can't hit pause like you can if you're, a lawyer, say, and call up some other lawyer and say, what does this Latin phrase mean? And you can't say, how do I get them to sit down? You're live. And so what we realized was the way that people in professions that acknowledged that they worked live, that they were performers, prepared, was by practice and by doing things over and over again before they went into the game. And that a tennis player or a surgeon or a musician would never dare to get up on stage or walk on center court without having hit, thousands of backhands or done thousands of scales before they walked in the room. And so this is the genesis of the book Practice Perfect, which is how do you prepare for complex tasks through practice? And we sort of outlined a vision for how you do that. And it's a little bit ironic because if I asked a room of 100 typical educators from around America, how often do you practice what you do in the classroom before you walk into the door, before you walk into the doors and play the game, they would look at me funny. But since having this realization, we've been working practice into our workshops and into our schools, and the results have been pretty incredible.
Well, most of us who lecture at the university level, teach at the university level, we practice on the job. If we're lucky, after a decade or so of teaching, we've learned some things. But I think most teachers at the university level, and tragically most teachers at the high school level, where they're not so much lecturing, they're interacting, you get into a rut. You get into a particular set of habits that you do groove, but they're not the good habits. They're the not so good habits sometimes. And there's a lot of learning that gets left behind as a result.
I think it's very true. And it reminds me of a story, actually, of two teachers in one of our schools. One of them was a teacher named Maggie, and she was a reading teacher. She was actually quite a good reading teacher, but she was struggling with discussions. And what would happen is she would start discussing a book. And when she got sometimes kids will give you an answer that is totally unexpected and, for want of a better term for it, totally wrong. And when she would get an answer like that, she didn't really know how to handle it.
Right. You don't want to say, boy, that's a stupid answer.
Right. She was surprised. And so she would step in with a comment that she wasn't happy with that would basically shut down the discussion. Let's say they're discussing Diary of Anne Frank, and she would say, no, Anna's afraid because she thinks the person knocking at the door is the SS and they're there to take her away, or is the Nazis and they're there to take her away. And so this would have the result of clarifying the mistake that the students, but it would totally kill the discussion. And she was very aware that she was doing this, but she couldn't fix it in the same way that you said, you noted, like college professors and teachers, they're often aware of your habits, but they're hard to fix. So she went to her principal with it, and he said, Nikki, who's another teacher in the school, is really good at this part of discussion. Why don't you check in with her and see if you guys can do some practice together? And they got together, and what Nikki suggested was, let's get together for 10 minutes 3 times a week, and you read me questions from your lesson plan that you're going to ask that day. And I'll pretend to be a student, and I will give you a totally unexpected wrong answer. And you can just practice reacting to it and responding to it. And so they would do this. And then Maggie would ask her questions of Nikki, then Nikki would ask her questions back of Maggie, so they both played both roles, and they kind of laughed about it, and they reflected on the answers. But after 3 or 4 weeks, Maggie was so comfortable responding to strange answers that, her classroom was completely transformed. And the most interesting part of the transformation was that she no longer really had to think about, how she was going to react to a strange wrong answer, because she could do it intuitively because she'd done it so many times. And her mind could be on the book or on the next question that she was going to ask. And so not only did she get better at it, but she freed up cognitive, processing capacity to worry about other things. And that kind of leads me to, I think it's a really fascinating story. One, because it's something you wouldn't necessarily think that would respond to practice. But two, it also suggests that one of the ways to be successful in teaching or in any other performance endeavor is to practice the things that you don't want to think about during the game. Yeah. Right? You think that what I should practice are the things that are most important during the game, and that is true. But one of the things you can also do is practice things. Once you automate something, it frees your mind to think about something else. So things like remembering not to ask yes or no questions, or tricks of behavior management. Right, dropping your voice an octave when you give a student a correction on their behavior, or whispering the correction to them. Those are all really simple things that are hard to remember to do in the game, but if you practice them a few dozen times beforehand, it happens without your thinking about it, and your mind can be free to be thinking about the math or the history or the science.
And let's talk about a couple of the techniques that you mentioned. And the book has 49 techniques for teachers. Those of us who are teachers, and I know we have a lot of listeners who are teachers, will find them interesting and useful. But I want to give the general listener some of the flavor of. We're not going to go through all 49, but I want to give our general listeners the flavor of what we mean by a technique, because I think for a lot of people, unfortunately, even some teachers, they'll think, well, like, what's a technique? Oh, well, I lecture with make sure my voice is loud enough, or eye contact's really important, but those are not really what the techniques are. So let's talk about, the first one I want to ask you about is Atbats. What is the technique that you call Atbats? And it has lessons that go beyond teaching.
Yeah, it's interesting. It definitely ties into the book on practice. So Atbats is the idea is that, we often ask, we think that the process of learning ends when students can get it right. But really to be able to do something, and to be able to do something well enough that your mind can be thinking about the next more complex thing you're going to learn, you need to have done it a lot. And so, being able to do one problem where you add fractions with unlike denominators right does not mean you've mastered adding fractions with unlike denominators. You really need to be able to do 20 of them or 100 of them and do them in different permutations. And so I think one of the things that we realized we weren't doing in our classroom is giving students, when we got to the point where they understood how to do something, enough practice at it that they drove it into muscle memory and they knew how to do it and they knew how to do it with confidence and they'd done it over and over again and they'd seen different variations on it. And so they were able to execute. When my son was a first grader, I went to back to school night and his teacher said, "Oh, I promise I won't give them, problem sets in math and won't ask them to do problems over and over again." And I thought to myself, no, that's fine. Please do, because I'm doing it, because you should know I'm doing it at home, and nothing could be more useful for him than to have done it over and over again. And in fact, that sort of often bears out in watching my own children in math. They've come to love math, but for a couple of years, they had experiences where they would do one problem right and move on to the next thing, and then a week later they wouldn't know how to do it.
Yeah, and I think the fascinating thing about math, and this happens in economics as well, you teach a concept and you think, well, now they know the concept, so now they can apply it. So I'll just give them an example that's just a little bit different. And then you show them that example and they go, well, we've never seen that before. And you're thinking, what do you mean? We've done 20 of those, but they don't. Yeah. They needed to do 50 so that it was so ingrained they could see the connections. And 3 is certainly not enough.
And you have to, to be able to step outside the calculation to think, oh, this is a problem. I know how to do this problem. This is this is a ratio problem. So I know how. You have to be comfortable enough, having seen enough of them, to be able to make that leap. I think it's interesting though that this also applies outside of math in ways that probably aren't as intuitive to all of us. I think one of the key skills that is behind the reading gap between students of privilege and students who aren't born to opportunity, or between strong readers and weak readers of any type, is vocabulary. Vocabulary, the strength of your vocabulary, and interestingly, the depth of your vocabulary correlates very, very strongly to academic achievement, better than almost anything. And interestingly, depth of word knowledge correlates better than breadth of word knowledge. In other words, if you really know your words and how to use them in 16 different scenarios, and you know what words go with them, and you know what nuance the words have, you do better than if you know a little bit about a lot of words. And so to really master a word, how many times do you need to practice a word to own it? 20, 30, how many times do you need to use a vocabulary word to own it? 20 or 30 times. And probably in different situations, and different, you need to use the adverb form, and then the adjective form, and then the noun form. And so, one of the things that we realized is really powerful to do with vocabulary instruction, and I think you can do this whether you're a teacher or you're a parent, is, wordplay is deeply important. And I think that for a lot of teachers and parents spend their time on vocabulary trying to arrive at the definition. What do you think the definition of mimic might be?
That way you can pass a vocabulary. That way you can pass a vocabulary test, which is something that happens occasionally in life, but most of life vocabulary is useful outside the test.
Yeah, well, if you'll suffer me geeking out on this a little bit more, if you spend your time trying to guess the definition, you have kids with imperfect knowledge trying to guess the definition. But if you give them the definition at the beginning and spend those 5 or 10 minutes practice, playing with the word, when might you mimic something? What is the difference between mimicking and imitating? Can you think of a time when you mimicked? Would a tyrant ever mimic? What would happen if you mimicked a tyrant? Lots and lots of wordplay like that. Kids are much more likely to understand the word in its nuance and depth. And interestingly, as Isabel Beck points out, and she just has an outstanding book on vocabulary called Bringing Words to Life, she says, if words overlap in meaning by 80% or 90%, mimic and imitate, say. We tend to teach them as synonyms.
Yeah.
But what's important from a reading perspective is the difference in the words. That mimic means to imitate, but in a pejorative sense, that you're making fun of someone. And so if you teach those words as synonyms, when you come across them in the reading, you won't get the implication of the text, and it will fail to help you from a reading comprehension perspective.
It's fabulous.
So
point.
I think, yeah. So it's actually the difference. It's the differences that are more important than the similarities, and that gets to the idea that lots of at-bats, lots of wordplay, deep knowledge of words is one of the most powerful things we can do for students.
So you call it at-bats because the way to become a better hitter is you got to swing the bat about 1,000 times a day. It's people think there's a lot of subtlety to hitting. I'm a huge student of hitting, actually, as a former Little League teacher and as a baseball fan.
That's interesting.
I'm interested in technique generally, teaching being one example. I'm fascinated by how some things are easy to teach. Others, such as singing, it's not so easy because you can't really hold your elbow the right way for singing the way you can with a baseball bat. But anyway, it's called at-bats for that reason, right?
That's right. It comes from the experience actually I had coaching. I don't know much about baseball, but my first teaching job, I got asked to coach a baseball team. And so I had this buddy who was an All-American in college, and he had a friend who was an outstanding coach. And I got half an hour with him over coffee, and to ask him all my questions about coaching baseball. And he cut me off in the middle and said, "Listen, it's about at-bats. Don't get fancy. Don't get cute. Put the ball right down the plate and have him swing the bat 100 times at least a day. It has to. Just the basic swing has to be intuitive. Do that over and over again. Next question." And in some ways, that's kind of the inspiration for the idea of doing something till it's intuitive, till you can do it in your sleep. Not only allows you to do it better, but it frees up your mind to be thinking about something else while you're executing. You can't have insights about what you're doing with a math problem if you're churning through the calculations. The calculations have to almost happen by themselves, and then you think, oh, wait, there's an easier way to do this. Yeah, there's a simpler way to do this.
I'll just tell a quick batting story. I took my kids to a batting coach once, and they're swinging away, and coach is having them work on something, and I mentioned to the coach while the lesson's going on, I said, "Well, can you believe that back foot? They're not squishing the bug. They're not rotating their hips or something, whatever I was noticing." And the coach looked at me and he said, very smart man, he said, "I think it's good to work at one thing at a time." And he was right. I saw 8 things that were wrong, and you can't fix 8 things. It's another, I know you're a big fan of small steps. I want to talk about one more technique, and then we're going to talk about some general issues. Now, Arnold Kling, who's an educator and author who's appeared on the program, he's one of his themes about education, that education is feedback. It's telling students what they know and don't know, and it's teachers learning what they know and don't know, what their students know and don't know. Talk about what call and response is as a technique and how it works, and cold calling as well.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with cold calling because to me, cold calling is one of the most powerful techniques you can use to sort of boost the academic rigor of a classroom instantly and powerfully. And the idea is that cold calling is calling on students regardless of whether they've raised their hand. In most classrooms, a teacher asks a question, and then a bunch of kids raise their hand, and the teacher thinks, who should I call on? But what cold call does is, and then those students answer the question, but cold calling makes it so that everyone answers the question, and then you decide who shares the answer. So what it means is I ask a question, what's 3 times 5? And then I say, Russ. And if it's clear that I'm cold calling, if I say something like, okay, I'm going to cold call now, be ready. 3 times 5 is what, Russ? Then everyone in the classroom, all 30 students in the classroom, have done that problem in their head because they're anticipating that it might be them who gets cold called. And so 3 things happen. 1, you get great engagement because students know they have to be on their toes and be ready to participate, and they can't sort of choose to opt out of the class for all or part of a lesson because they could be called on at any time. And so they're engaged and they're thinking along and they're doing the cognitive work whether or not they get called on. And number 2, it just can speed up the pacing of the class. I think we've all been in a classroom where the teacher says something like this. Let's see, I'd like to go over number 2 on the homework. Who'd like to answer number 2? I'm seeing the same 3 hands.
And everybody else who doesn't get called on checks out.
Right. I'd really like to hear from the boys in the back. Do I need to remind you all that participation is graded in my class? So a couple things happen there. One, yes, a bunch of students tune out. Two, I just wasted 15 seconds pleading with my class to answer a question. And if you multiply that, how many questions get asked over the course of the year, it's actually an incredibly massive amount of time that is wasted pleading with students to participate when you could just say, who'd like to answer? So let's go over number 2 on the homework. Russ, what did you get for number 2? Right? And it doesn't have to be a gotcha. It can be better when it's an invitation to a real conversation. But then all of a sudden, all that time that I waste and all the energy that gets sucked out of the room by hearing the teacher plead for participation is gone, and class is fast and energetic, and students are engaged. And the last reason why cold calling is so deeply important is because it allows you to check for understanding. I know that you're kind of a sports guy, but the great basketball coach John Wooden said, it's not whether you taught it, it's whether they learned it. And if you ask me for, when I rewrite Teach Like a Champion, the technique I'm going to put first in the book, in the first chapter, and it's going to get its own chapter, is check for understanding. On the premise that the fundamental criteria, the fundamental attribute of a great teacher is his or her willingness to seek and see the difference between I taught it and they learned it. And so one of the things that I need to be able to do when I've taught something to my students is to be able to take a sample of the room and see how well they know the material that I just asked them. Great. So let's go over the Stamp Act. Who passed the Stamp Act and when? And what was the reaction in the House of Burgesses? And what did the governor of Virginia say about that? And how did the rest of the American colonies react? And if they can answer those questions, then I have a pretty good sense that they've learned it. But if I only rely on the students who raise their hands to tell me, I'm instantly getting a flawed statistical sample, because the kids who raise their hands are more likely to know it than the kids who don't raise their hand. And so I have to be able to check for understanding reliably, I have to have normalized the experience of my saying, Eric, what do you think? Great. And Stuart, what about you? And Sarah, and Alice, so that I can call on anyone I want to at any time to check their knowledge.
What does a cold caller do when the student says, can you repeat the question? And then says, I don't know. And just opts out anyway. So they're sitting there looking out the window. You call on them to get their attention, and they're not paying attention. They don't want to.
Yeah, it's great. So I think one of the reasons, one of the keys to doing cold call well is to engaging students before they get off task. But obviously this happens. And so one of the techniques I might use there is a technique called no opt-out, which is, let's say I ask you a question. Russ, what governing body passed the Stamp Act?
I don't know.
You look at me and you say, I don't know. I say, great, listen carefully and we'll make sure you get there. Daphne, what governing body passed the Stamp Act? The Parliament. Great, back to you, Russ. Who passed the Stamp Act? Right,
Parliament.
And then over time you learn that you're not going to save any work for yourself by saying I don't know, because you're going to answer the question anyway in the end. And so then over time, hopefully I would say, maybe instead of having Daphne give you the answer, I might say, Daphne, can you tell Russ what governing body did not pass the Stamp Act? And maybe that will help him realize which one did.
Beautiful.
She might say, there's a Continental Congress. It had nothing to do with the Continental Congress. It's like, great, it was not a governing body in the United States. Now can you tell me who passed the Stamp Act?
Yeah, beautiful.
And so, and obviously one of the keys to doing this well is one of the other techniques in the book, which is called emotional constancy, which is as soon as I get mad at a student for struggling and being wrong, I do two things. One is I teach that student that they should try to hide their errors from me because I'll get mad at them. And the result is that then it's harder for me to find their errors, and it's harder for me to check for understanding and ensure their knowledge. And so I want to avoid that. But the other thing is that when I insert my anger, I dilute or I destroy the sense that getting it wrong and getting it right is the normal state of learning. Of course you got it wrong. Of course you struggled. Of course you had if you could answer all the questions, there would be no sense in my asking them of you. And so I want to normalize error and make it safe to be wrong in my classroom. And so teachers have to do that when they do, with techniques like cold call and no opt-out. That affective part of the classroom is critical as well.
So what is call and response? And then we'll move on.
Call and response, yeah, great. So call and response, we see primarily as an engagement technique, which is I say an answer aloud and I expect the whole class to give me a response in chorus. So I might say, let's say I'm reviewing multiplication facts. I might say, let's review some multiplication facts. 3 times 5 class on 2, 1, 2, and you would all say 15, and then I'd say great. And then if I multiply that by three more, I should get, and then the whole class would say 45, great. And I divide by 9, and I'm left with 5. And the idea is that A, it causes everyone to do the cognitive work as opposed to the one student who I call on, and B, it's sort of high energy back and forth, a little bit like a workout.
Yeah.
And so it can be really, I know the principal of a really great school. It's a primary school, and he says he wants his teachers to do 5 call-and responses in the first 5 minutes of a lesson. So students feel like they have every student feels like he or she has a back and forth with the teacher and is engaged and is actively participating in the classroom.
That's also
it's
also a very effective pop quiz, because you see a very crude but effective pop quiz. You see that 60% of the students answered. You realize maybe I didn't cover that so well, or they all hesitate. You realize I better go over it 3 more times. So I used to do it all the time, teaching microeconomics. It's one of my favorite techniques. I loved it, and it does energize everybody. It's a fabulous strategy. Great.
Now, can I tell you one other great trick for a pop quiz that you're saying that just reminded me of?
Yeah, sure.
I saw a teacher do it the other day. So it requires multiple choice questions, but multiple choice questions can be rigorous as well. So this teacher that I'm thinking of is a math teacher, and he calls the game rock, scissors, paper, and he'll give the kids a set of math problems. Let's say it's a pop quiz on, last night's homework. It's 5 problems. So he'll have them complete them, and he'll say, okay, number 1, rock, scissors, paper. And when he says rock, scissors, paper, the kids slap their desk 3 times, and they hold up 1 to 4 fingers, depending on which answer they thought it was to the first question. And so he can instantly scan the room and say, okay, the right answer was 4, and 15 kids got 4, but 10 kids didn't. And of the 10 kids who got it wrong, 8 of them said answer choice number 2. So now I know, A, that I have a problem here in terms of mastery, and B, that there's something about answer choice number 2 that fooled them. So I'm going to go back and reteach it and take a particularly close look at answer choice number 2 and understand why that was so distracting to students. So this idea of just making the answer visible through hand signals is a really effective way to gather a ton of data very efficiently and very quickly.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Although when I used to teach that kind of technique, I would often make choice number 2 deliberately wrong in a way that I thought would fool them so that they could see that they didn't understand it, which is another part of this feedback story, that it's important that students see what they don't understand, not just, oh, yeah, I understand that, I can move on.
It's interesting. You're going exactly where great teachers go, which is that after you've sort of made error visible and learned from it, then you want to invest in sort of analyzing error. That error is actually one of the most powerful teaching tools.
Yeah,
and
so, fabulous.
Asking questions like, why would someone have chosen number 2? What's the reason? Why is it? What's right about wrong answer number 2 that fooled people?
It fooled you, yeah.
Those are all really powerful.
Why'd you go down that wrong path so far? Why didn't you see that it was dangerous? But you didn't. So you need a warning sign there. Now we had David Epstein on this program talking about the role of practice versus genetic ability in sports, actually. And his book is partially, not totally, but it takes on Malcolm Gladwell's claim that, with practice, you can do anything. And I'm a big fan of practice, but I'm also aware of the limitations of the human body and the human brain. Do you think great teachers can be made? Can you take a bad teacher, teach them the 49 techniques and teach them? And I don't know if we ever covered this, but your point, your first set of workshops didn't work because people didn't practice. We got into practice, but so you practice it, you make it work for them, you show them how it works, you unleash them back in the classroom. How much improvement you think you can get from a teacher who starts off lousy and from these kind of techniques?
I do emphatically believe that teachers can be trained, that teachers can be taught. And I would just say that I fear for what it says about our belief in education if we don't think we can train people if we don't think we can teach people to be teachers.
That's a good point.
We think we can teach people to be economists. We think we can teach people to be accountants. We think we can teach people to be surgeons. We don't think we can teach people to be teachers. there's a deep and disturbing irony to the assumption that teaching is something that cannot be taught, and I just reject it. And I think our experience rejects it. I don't think that implies that every single person can become a great teacher. I think that people who are willing to learn, who have a mindset of openness, I would say that if we can't make them at least effective teachers, and many, many of them really good teachers, and make all of them significantly better, then we have to ask ourselves questions about the training that we offer because it's broken.
Do you think it varies?
Because the first obligation of an organization is to make its people better.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I would also, there's a difference in some ways, but, you mentioned David Epstein's just outstanding book, which I love, even though I'm obsessed with practice. But I think his book is also to some degree about the rarefied, what it takes to be an elite athlete, to be a world-class sprinter. And so, do I know for sure that you could get every teacher to be the top, 0.1% of teachers? Perhaps not. I think there are things that are maybe beyond training there. But should we be able to get, 90% of teachers into the top two quartile of into what are now the top two quartiles? Absolutely. And I think that's where people maybe misunderstand David's book. I think he still believes strongly in practice.
Absolutely.
What he's saying is, when you get to the world of, elite performance now, it's not enough to practice, that you have to have the right physiology, because there's so many people clamoring for those few spots, at the starting blocks. And so you have to have had the foresight to be born with the right physiology. But I think that's sort of a special case of
absolutely
elite performance.
Do you think it varies by field? Do you think it's easier to make a great math teacher better, a good math teacher a great one, than a good English teacher a great one, a bad math teacher a good one, a bad English teacher a good one?
Well, I think it varies by field for sure, in that I think there are really three domains of knowledge that you need to master to be a great teacher. One of them is general teaching techniques. I think that cold call and checking for understanding, are really important for any teacher to know how to do, and how to manage a classroom, So when you walk into a classroom full of skeptical 16-year-olds and you say, okay, everyone sit down, please, and the kids say, you sit down. If you don't know how to handle that situation, it doesn't matter how much you know about math, you're not going to win. So one, there's sort of general teaching knowledge that's very powerful. And then there's subject-specific content. If you don't know the math, if you don't have deep knowledge about literature and how it works, you're not going to be very successful. And that part is very hard to train. In a training setting, you really have to have your content knowledge beforehand. And I would say a significant issue in teacher training is the level of content knowledge people have coming to the field. But then there's a middle group of skills, which are sort of content-specific teaching approaches. How do you teach reading? How do you teach math? There are obviously specific things, the science teacher, the history teacher, the music teacher, that you do differently. And so I think there are certainly, each endeavor in teaching is different in that it requires different skills, and specific knowledge in that area. I'd say they're all uniquely difficult. I wouldn't want to opine on which one is most difficult. I would say that the one that we see the most difference in how we hire for is reading teachers. That, each book requires a different active, insightful interpretation. And there's just a level of intellect and interpretation that reading teachers tend to be harder. People who are going to be successful as reading teachers tend to be a little bit harder to identify in the selection process than our math teachers, where we feel like we can often, we can find someone relatively reliably through our selection criteria.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I was going to get to it later. How do you find, when you're involved day to day in running a school, you've got these bright-eyed, chipper 22-year-olds, maybe 24-year-olds if they've been to graduate school. They all look pretty similar coming out. How do you decide who the good ones are, to at least to get started? Yeah.
Over time, it's interesting. Selecting people has become such a critical area of what we do. One of the most important things we do is we ask people to teach. I think that a lot of hiring for teaching involves talking to people about teaching. And what you get is people who can talk about teaching and who are articulate, and often, can be really reflective and can describe all the nuances and challenges and the perversities and the ambiguities and the paradoxes. And that is very different from being able to get in front of a class and do it. And in fact, an ability to articulate all the paradoxes, and ambiguities in some ways probably inversely correlates to your ability and willingness to get up in front of the class and do it. So the first thing that we figured out was, we should limit the amount of time we spend talking to them, and we should see people teach and ask them to come in and teach a sample lesson to our kids and see how they do. And so that proved to be incredibly revealing. But as someone who's really passionate about feedback, I think you'll appreciate that what we then learned was that even more important than watching someone teach was watching them react to feedback after their teaching. So what we do now is we have people in to teach a sample lesson, and then we sit them down afterwards and we give them feedback. And we say, here are a couple of things that we loved in your lesson. We thought were really just great. You handled the situation really well. We loved this question. Super job there. If you were part of this organization, we think teaching is important enough that we would constantly give you constructive feedback too. Here are 2 things that we think you could have done differently in the lesson to make it more rigorous. So first I'm looking for, how are they reacting to this? Are they writing it down? Are they open-minded about it? Do they ask questions about it? Are they folding their arms and saying, yeah, well, I couldn't really do that right then because, are they defensive about the feedback? And in the long run, someone who is open to feedback, who comes in, who scores a 6 in skill, but is thirsty for feedback and hungry and wants it, I'm going to hire that person over someone who comes in at an 8 or an 8.5, but who's a little bit defensive and doesn't want to hear someone tell them about their teaching. Because ultimately the 6 is going to pass the 8 pretty quickly, especially if I keep her for 5 or 10 years, which is what I want to do, and she's going to take other people with her because of her learning modality. But then the most interesting thing we realized is instead of just watching people take feedback and inferring whether we think they're good at it, we should just ask them to come back and reteach. Great, when you come back, we'd love to see you implement cold call and see if you can check for understanding more deliberately during the lesson and make sure that you have a really good sense for how students are doing, and then tell us afterwards what you thought they learned well and what they didn't. And if someone is able to, to teach, to take feedback and to apply it in the next lesson, I'm buying. I just think that's someone that if we can't put that person to great use changing the lives of students, we're in the wrong, it's us who are the problem and not them.
Well, that's a tough test, though, given what you said earlier about practice. So many of those teachers, they're brand new. They've never cold called. You're giving them this new technique. They might be excited about it, but they might not know how to do it. I guess the best ones would say, how do you do that?
That's right. And the very best ones are people say, could I practice that right now?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very high level.
Or we'll suggest it and we'll say, why don't you pretend that, maybe 2 or 3 of us in the room, so why don't you pretend that we're your students right now? Why don't you ask us a few questions and pretend to cold call? Great, try it this way, try it that way. Someone who's willing to roll up their sleeves like that and risk being wrong to be able to get it in the short run, to be able to get it right in the long run. Again, I just think that teaching attracts such incredible people who are so willing to do whatever it takes to change the lives of others, who are so altruistic and inspirational that in some ways what I love about this process is it unlocks those people who are they're the most important people in our society. Democracy is predicated on education. The economic, you're an economist. The economist Eric Hanushek ran a 40-year analysis.
Many-time guest on this program.
Oh, great. He's brilliant. And so he ran a 40-year analysis of test scores in education test scores in Latin American countries and their GDP growth rates. And the test scores explain 80% of the GDP growth rates over 40 years. So the people who determine how fast we learn more, how much we develop, how much our brains grow, determine our economic viability, not just as individuals, but as the nation. And they determine our democratic viability. They're the most important people in our culture. And so I love to find people who are great at that work. And then, to me, a process that identifies them is, I just find it incredibly exciting the moment when you realize you're sitting in the room with someone who's going to be a great teacher and they don't even know it yet, but you know it.
Exhilarating, yeah. Now, a lot of people claim when confronted with various ideas for improving schools or changing school systems that there's no really good metric for what determines a good teacher. We understand that test scores alone aren't valuable because some people get the good students, et cetera. There's all kinds of other variables. And so people say, well, we don't know who the good teachers are. And so it's not fair, say, to have merit pay or whatever or principals shouldn't have a lot of power because they can do arbitrary things. I feel very differently. I know in my kid's school, all the good teachers and all the bad ones. And in particular, I know which ones are good for me, for my kids. Now, it may be that someone else disagrees with me because their kids need to have different needs. That's totally understandable. But the idea that somehow it's just a black box, and I'm asking that because you describe, and I love this, you describe teaching as a craft. And craft, by definition, is not science. There are maybe techniques and practice things that make you better, but as we've already said, some people are gifted in certain ways and their sensitivity to what's going on in the room in a way that other people can't, and they'll never implement the technique the same way other people do. It'll always be better, always worse. So in any school, there are differences in performance across those teachers. Do you think do you think the administrators in a good school know who the good teachers are?
Well, the answer to that question is to me, is yes. There's data out there. It's interesting. I think it's the classic case of misapplied data. Invariably, once a year, someone quotes to me data that says, well, the average principal, it turns out, is not a very good judge of a good teacher. And if you ask the average principal to correlate, their own perception of teacher effectiveness to value-added gains or, some strong, reliable measure of data, they're not very good. And that may be true. I'm a little bit suspicious of that because usually people who make that argument are actually, they don't want to use the test either as an objective measure, so I don't know what they're measuring against. But what that does not mean, I think what that does not mean is that excellent principals are not good judges of teachers. And in fact, excellent principals, strong principals are great judges of teacher quality. And this is proven in the data. And in fact, this is the definition of a great principal, is someone who understands what good teaching is and can identify it and can support it. And so to me, it only underscores a couple of things. It underscores the incredible importance of school leadership and how school leadership, we have to, autonomy and accountability have to live together in an organization. And we have to free our school leaders to make real decisions so that they can really influence what happens in their schools and hold them accountable for it. And that, I believe passionately in educational data. I think it has flaws for sure. It will only get better by our using it. But I think where it's most powerful is as an organizational management tool. So when I see a school district, or a state publish its teachers' test scores in the newspaper, I just think that's wrong. One, because it's just not the way to treat people. But two, I think that educational data is really powerful in the hands of good managers. And so a good principal who's accountable for test scores at the school level can take the scores of individual teachers and say, aha, I have a hypothesis from looking at these test scores that this teacher is struggling in math. And I've seen her teach, and it's borne out by what I've seen her teaching. And I think that I can, now I think I know what to do to fix it. Or I think it was a one-year thing. I think this class just got the better of her. I've seen it borne out over multiple years. It's a management tool to be used by a manager to drive organizational results, as opposed to, the point of accountability should be the school, and then the manager of the school should have the flexibility to hold individual teachers accountable. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it means there would have to be differences in rules about how teachers could be
assessed,
promoted and developed and assessed. And just as important as having the conversation about shaking hands with the teacher and saying, I'm so glad that you want to teach, but but your results aren't good enough for the kids who get one chance to learn, and so I'm going to have to ask you to go back to training or to work somewhere else because you can't work here. Like, that is a conversation that I've had with people. It is not pleasant, but it has to be done. And teaching is such hard work and such hard intellectual work that it's folly to assume that conversation doesn't have to happen and that you can protect all jobs equally. But just as important as that is the conversation with the great teacher, where I say, like, I've always known that you're great, and I watch you teach and you inspire me, and now I have the data to show how much you change kids' lives, and I want to talk to you about how to make your influence better, and I want to reward you in every way that I can think of. I want you to tell me the things that would make you happy professionally, the opportunities you want, so I can make you love this work and do it forever. We also fail in that conversation. We fail in that conversation worse than we fail in the dismissal conversation, and it's more important because more desperately sad than losing out on great people who don't enter the teaching profession because the labor dynamics of it are dysfunctional are all the great people who leave the profession because they will never be differentiated from their least competent peer.
Couldn't agree with you more. Now, when you wrote Teach Like a Champion, it was came out in 2010, at least the paperback that I have, and it says there were 10 uncommon schools, this chain of charter schools you're involved in. They're now, I think, 32. Is that correct?
I think we're up at 38 this year, believe it or
not. So my question is, following up on what we're talking about with teachers, how do you evaluate teachers? Is it a formal process? Do you give what kind of feedback do you give your staff? Because my impression is in a lot of schools, and this is universities through K through 12, there's not a lot of evaluation. Because people say we can't really evaluate. It can't really be,
Right. And there are several forms of evaluation. I mean, I'd say the first thing that has to happen is, our first obligation is to make people better. And so when we, one of our rules of thumb is every teacher should be observed at least every 3 weeks. If it's for 10 minutes, that's fine. But if I'm really seeking to understand a teacher, I'm going to have to see them in their classroom. And I'm not going to be able to see them on the, like the dog and pony show when they know I'm coming on March 3rd. It's better for them and better for me if I see a wide array of, statistical data points on what happens. And, I need to understand what's typical in their classroom. So I need to be in there constantly. And my focus to be in their classroom needs to be my goal for being in here is to make you better. And at some point, we have a conversation about, whether you're doing the job well enough. But I want 90%, I want my teachers to be happy when my principals walk in the classroom because they know they're going to get helped. Right before Teach Like a Champion came out, there's an article in the New York Times Magazine about the book. And there's a picture in which I was standing in the back of a classroom taking notes on a teacher. And someone wrote on a comment like, clearly this guy doesn't know anything about running schools because, how humiliating for the teacher to have someone, evaluating her and making notes on her in the back of the classroom, while she's teaching. Like, it must make her incredibly stressed. But in fact, the teacher who's in the classroom is a teacher named Katie Bellucci, who's since become, one of our top teachers and a senior teacher in the school. She was happy to have me in the classroom because we had a great working relationship, and she knew that my purpose for being there was to help her make the most of her incredible skills and to become a great teacher, which she really has become. I just think it's a sad and cynical view of the profession to see such a divide between administration and teaching. And so I think that the first thing that has to happen with evaluation is it has to be done in the spirit of like my goal is to make you better. Now, then in Uncommon Schools, do we go the next step? Yeah, of course. There's a mid-year performance review and an end-of-the-year performance review for every teacher. It's not based on a single observation, though. Ideally, it's based on, dozens and dozens of observations, not only of your classroom, but of the work that students do that comes out of your classroom. I look at your lesson plans. I look at interval test data. I look at the tests that you write and the quality of what students do in your classroom. Talk to your department chair. And so then we have a conversation, and, the principals at Uncommon Schools are great principals, and they're really good judges of good teaching. And yes, then they also use objective data like state test scores. So there is, evaluation at some point, but it comes long after a long-standing conversation about, let me help you to become the best teacher that you can be. And so even that conversation hopefully is grounded in a foundation of trust. And if it comes down to, you've worked so hard and I'm grateful for how hard you've worked, or I've asked you to work hard and to be honest, you have not been willing to put in that work, and I understand why, and I understand why there are 100 distractions, but I have to tell you that, that this is not the school for you, which happens very rarely. Like, that conversation can still happen built on a foundation of trust. But I really believe the McKinsey study, which said, one of the great quotes from the McKinsey study of the best school systems in the world said, the quality of a school or a school system can never exceed the quality of its teachers. So I think we're only going to be good if our teachers love working for us, if they feel so trusted, if they feel safe, if they feel like they're never going to be, done an injustice by the evaluation system, if it's based on complete trust and the notion that it's about making them better. And if that doesn't happen in an organization, you're dead.
So we had recently had Lance Pritchett on as a guest talking about his book, The Rebirth of Education. And one of the themes of that book is that the trappings of a great school do not make a great school. There has to be something living, beating at the heart of it. There's something systemic and organic about a great school. So you can have all the best smart boards and all the best student-teacher ratio, right. You can mimic Finland, which everybody and I should have said imitate. You can imitate Finland. Right. You can imitate
or mimic them, frankly.
Yeah, well, probably. So we can do what Finland's doing, and of course, in a horrible school system that imitates what Finland's doing will remain a horrible school system. It'll just have a high student-teacher ratio or whatever Finland's doing that's been successful. So I'm curious. I'm thinking about the scatter plot we talked about. We've got a school in the upper right corner, meaning high poverty and high achievement, which is an outlier, but it exists. And it's not a literal outlier. It's not like there's one school that's managed to do it. There are dozens. Unfortunately, there's hundreds that are down at the bottom, but there's dozens that are doing it beautifully well. There's something systemic going on there. It's not just, I assume, that those schools have teachers that have mastered the best techniques. What I'm going to suggest, especially after what you just said, is that those schools have found a way to motivate, or at least to attract teachers who are motivated, because teaching, despite what everyone believes, is hard work. It's not something you can just do on the side. And as you said, it's a performance profession. So if you think you can stand up there in front of those skeptical 16-year-olds and go through the motions, you're going to get kicked. And unfortunately, avoiding going through the motions means working. It means preparing. It means practicing and drilling the things you need to be doing. It means contact with students outside of class in all kinds of ways. Why are some schools
caring about you and respecting you enough to say, look, I know that lesson was not the best work that you can do.
Yeah. So
and
why
I
is
want to help you to do the best work that you can do every day.
So why is it that some schools, not teachers, right? We've been talking about what makes a great teacher. What makes a great school?
I think I think that you're spot on that it's not just a school is greater than the sum of its teachers, and in fact, a great school is an organization that makes people better. We talk about this a lot because we try and recruit great teachers, but in the end, if I do what you said, which is I attract great teachers to my school, in the big picture, that's a Pyrrhic victory. There's an amazing teacher across the city. She teaches 30 kids in her classroom. I convinced her to come to my school. She teaches my 30 kids. Her results are outstanding. It's just 30 kids. Just a question of which 30 kids, but it's just 30 kids who are getting stronger. The question is, does my organization make her better so that those 30 kids get even better, and so that she rubs off on other people, and so that 30 kids in someone else's classroom are better because she's there? And so I think that it boils down to culture among the adults, an environment of, team spirit, that we are about excellence, and we're going to do this together. We're going to build each other up. And there's going to be a culture of candor in doing it, but we're going to build each other up. And it's about training. It's about skills. I think that people like to win. They like to be a part of organizations that they know make them better, where at the end of the day, who wants to commit their lives to doing hard work when at the end of the day they're not sure that they won? Everyone wants to play for the Yankees. Everyone wants to play, if you're a soccer player, you want to play in the Champions League because you want to feel like you want to be able to look back and know that you won. And so I think that schools are successful because they make people, in the end, they respect people, they honor them for their skills, and they make people better. And if you're better at making people better, you're on your way to building a culture where people feel trust and appreciation. And they don't mind working hard, because what greater gift is there to work hard for something you believe in?
And yet, despite that, it's a lovely thought. Our school system in America doesn't generally reliably create those schools. And I would suggest there's something not so healthy with our system. You've made a decision, and I honor it. I have tremendous respect for it. You're working through the charter school system. You're making, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect you're making a big difference in 30 times 20 times 20 times 38, whatever it is, schools that you're involved in, it's kind of it's a desperate, somewhat poignant attempt to make an end around a system that's dysfunctional. And I'll say why it's dysfunctional. It's dysfunctional because, Lance Pritchett talked about the parent who stood before his village, having heard that his kids had learned nothing in 5 years, not just disappointing test scores. They couldn't read and they couldn't do simple math problems. They had learned nothing. And that teacher, the headmaster of that school, said, well, that's because you're stupid. What do you expect?
Right.
This poor man said, my life's been a donkey's life. I wanted my kids to have something different. I trusted you, and you betrayed me. And this headmaster laughed at him, basically, and gets away with it. And we don't have that level of dysfunctionality in the United States, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, we have a lot of schools where parents don't have choices because they don't have the money to send their kids to private schools. They can't afford to move out into a good neighborhood. They're stuck in that lousy neighborhood. Right. We have this bizarre system.
Well, people who say that we don't have school choice in this country don't know anything about real estate prices.
Right. Well, that's the problem. We have something like school choice, but it's very expensive, and people who are of limited means can't make those choices that other people can't. Those people have great schools, as Lance Pritchett also talked about. Right? You live in a wealthy suburb in America, you have good schools, partly, I believe, because the parents can send their kids to a private school, so they have to compete.
I would also say that, I would say one of the dirty little secrets of American education is that what they have is schools that have tremendous selection effects. I don't always know that our schools are even our elite. I mean, I had a funder who funds my work training teachers. And, my passion is inner city work. And he said, I get that your passion is inner city work, and you can relax because I'm going to fund you. But here's the one thing I ask of you. The dirty little secret of American education is that our middle class and our upper middle class schools are terrible, and they're going to get their lunch eaten by Singapore and China and India and parts of Europe, and they don't even realize it because they have a selection effect. And so I want you to do at least one set of trainings for a suburban school somewhere to see if it works, because that's the thing that I care about. I don't care about the inner city, he said to me. I care about, the suburban and the middle class, upper middle class suburban schools that
so-called
are
gifted
the engine of the current economy. These are the places that's going to drive our current economy. The so-called talented kids are not talented enough, and it's going to be the death of the American economy. And I have to say, I thought about that long and hard after I walked out of that meeting with him.
Well, I don't think it's going to
scary, and
I'm not that pessimistic. I don't think it's the death of the American economy. What I do think is that we've shortchanged a lot of people.
His words, not mine, but I think it's look, there's an achievement gap everywhere.
Yeah,
there's definitely a rich-poor achievement gap. There's an achievement gap between what our schools are and what they could be. There's I have 3 kids. There's a really big gap between what the schools they go to. Schools that would be the equivalent to what they deserve and what they are, anywhere. There's a gap between us and the best schools in the world. The benefit that we have in inner city schools is that generally people get the urgency. I think in suburban schools, people are often pretty insulated from the urgency. One of the best suburban principals I know started working with her teachers on a bunch of really great stuff, and her biggest struggle was that she just said they wanted to say to her, just leave me alone. We're fine. Can't you see the scores? We're great. We're fill in the name of the school district here. Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to become excellent?
And those kids are getting SAT tutoring, and that's what part of the reason their scores are so high. There's a lot of missed opportunity, and the incentives, I believe, in our current school system are not conducive to excellence, and it's a tragedy. Let's talk about Econ Talk, if we could. This is an entertainment and educational program. I always say it's both. If it's not educational, I don't want to be involved in it. If it's only education, it's not going to get as many listeners as it would if it is entertaining.
You're not going to ask me to sing, are you?
No, absolutely not. But you could be juggling while we're talking in the background, and there's no harm in claiming it because it's not verifiable. What I'm thinking about in reading your book and talking to you today and getting ready for this interview made me wonder. This is a nice podcast. People like it. They send me nice emails. They say you out there, you say you've learned things from this, which touches me deeply. I bet you could learn a lot more. I bet I could structure this program in ways that would help you learn more. I bet I could do things outside of the hour-long interview that would help you learn more. Now, some of you out there do an amazing thing. You listen to each episode more than once, or special episodes more than once. Some of you tell me you listen to them 4 and 5 times. That's one way to get more out of it. It's impressive. It touches me again. But I bet there's some simpler, less time-consuming ways I could make it better. And I'm curious if you've thought about not Econ Talk per se, but audio, conversation as a way of learning, and what perhaps might be done on the internet that would improve these kind of educational opportunities.
That's a fascinating question. And not wanting to sort of this is a little bit outside my area of expertise, and didn't have a lot of time to prepare for the question. But one thing that I feel really passionately about, 2 things. One is writing. That I don't think you really understand something until you have gone through the process of disciplining it into words. You have a professor of mine in college described the difference between a notion and an idea, and he said a notion was half an idea, but when you've put it into specific words and into syntax and been disciplined about saying what it is and what it isn't, when you've written it down in paper, then it becomes an idea. And so the first thing I would want to think about would be giving people the opportunity to process in writing. I think it's one of the forms of rigor that we miss most in our classrooms, in the U.S. generally, that if every class ended with students writing one carefully crafted sentence capturing the complexity, one of the most challenging ideas from that hour's instruction, education would be much more rigorous. And so I guess I would ask, is there a way for your listeners to write in response to the program, to process what they've taken away from the program? And of course, there are all sorts of electronic tools now that you could use to gather data from that and give people feedback on their writing. The people that I know who do the best work around, MOOCs and online modules and online training are really good about making it constantly interactive and making it come down to a lot of writing. And so that would be at least the place where I would start looking. I don't think you know it until you can put it in writing.
It's a great idea. I'm going to think about that.
As I found out every time I tried to write a paper in college, right? I thought I understood the play until I had to write about it.
It also helps you remember it. My last question. You're doing some amazing things. You're growing. Your Uncommon Schools we're up to 38. I'd love for you to have 250. Are you a voice in the dark? Do you feel you're part of something that's changing, or are you just influencing the people who are right around you? Are you optimistic for the future?
Yeah, I'm really, really optimistic. I mean, I go back to my observations about the incredible people who become teachers in this country. You know they're not going to be paid well. You know they're not going to get the respect they deserve for their work often, and yet they do it anyway. I think the thing that surprised me most about writing Teach Like a Champion is how open people have been to working with me and with my team, and how much they've really reached out and wanted to learn, wanted to engage us. And I'm talking about schools way outside the charter sector and often outside the urban school sector. But, school districts of every stripe and variety around the country, school districts around the world, and schools and school systems have reached out and said, could we talk to you about this? Could we come to one of your workshops? Would you do a training for us? I'm just humbled by the willingness of people to hear me out. People who have every incentive to say, oh, that guy, he's a part of that vast conspiracy. He's a part of charter schools. He's a part of, but generally people in education do not, you might think that they would think that way, but the great majority of them don't. I think there are a few loud voices that are full of invective, but for the most part, people in the teaching profession, the education profession, want to make schools better, and they're willing to look at any tools that they think can get them there, no matter where they come from. My colleague Paul Bambrick says that buy-in is an outcome, not a precondition. That if training is good, people will come to believe in it. That of course people walk into the relationship with you sometimes with their arms, metaphorically folded because they've been there before. But if your work is really good, that they will open their arms and they will they will give it a try. And, we found that pretty consistently. So, the workshops that we do, a lot of them are outside the charter school sector. And people have been really receptive, and we've learned a ton from watching them use the techniques. And that's a lot of what's in Teach Like a Champion 2.0 is what we've learned from people using it. So, I'm very optimistic about the people in the teaching profession. And I look forward to the day when there's more autonomy for them. I think autonomy comes with accountability, and there are more ways to honor them for the work that they do.
My guest today has been Doug Lemov. He is the author of Teach Like a Champion and Practice Perfect. Doug, thanks for being part of Econ Talk.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more Econ Talk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for Econ Talk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.